Hello everyone, Train King James here, and today we are going to celebrate my 9th anniversary on YouTube. I've been on YouTube 9 years, and the journey has been absolutely incredible. And what better way to celebrate 9 years than doing something I've never done on this channel before? And that would be to do a top 10 episode list, where I go through my favorite episodes from the show, Thomas and Friends, obviously. Emphasis on the word favorite, not best, as it'll be based on my subjective opinion on the episodes. There'll be some episodes that you think should be on this list that won't, and some that you'll be surprised that are on the list. But after all, it's my favorite episodes, not what could be objectively called the best episodes of this series. Anyways, let's get on with the list. Number 10, The Deputation. This is probably not the first episode you expect to see on this list, but this is one of my favorites of the show, because of its familial values. I've always seen the characters of the show as more family than as friends, as they often don't get along, they argue, there's a lot of problems, and they don't necessarily treat each other nicely. But they stand by each other because they are all that they have. And this episode really highlights it. Donald and Douglas are in a tough situation where episodes before many of the characters were having issues with the twins and making fun of them or getting annoyed with them, to the point now that Donald and Douglas in this episode have garnered enough respect that everyone wants to stand up to the Fat Controller, something seen as incredibly difficult to do by the characters. On top of it, this episode has a great cast, has some iconic dialogue, particularly with Percy, and the way that it uses the cast within it, from the misunderstanding of what a deputation really is, to all of the characters' opinions on what they should do with Donald and Douglas, to that big indignation scene at Tidmouth when the characters discuss how exactly to go about it. It's a great episode with many iconic shots, and of course, I'm a sucker for Donald and Douglas in winter episodes. I love the concept of them with a van between their tenders clearing the tracks, and this episode has a great sequence at the beginning, showing the very first time the twins would do that in the series. Another interesting thing about this episode is that it's a bottle episode, meaning that it's a very contained story, mainly in one location amongst the characters dealing with an issue. For the most part, most likely due to weather, the characters are contained at Tidmouth, and the story mainly hangs around there. And the fact that the episode is still just as entertaining as any other episode that travels all over the island is very interesting. All in all, a very solid start to a very good list of episodes. Number 9, Troublesome Trucks / Foolish Freight Cars. For those of you who already didn't know, James is my favorite character in the series, so expect to see him a lot on this list. But here he is in one of his earliest appearances in the show, and it's one of my favorites. Another quiet episode where not a lot happens, but it's still a very nice episode for James, because I think it's one of the few episodes where we see the real James. James usually hides himself in a cloud of vanity, and usually has to prop up his own insecurities by trying to talk about his own self-importance. But this is a vulnerable James. This is a James that believes that he really needs to prove himself, and is given probably the thing he likes least to do: pulling the most troublesome trucks on the entire island in a singular train, and making a very important delivery for the chance to prove that he belongs in the railway, and to him, more importantly, stay red. At no point in this episode does James complain. At no point is James trying to boast. He's focused and determined. And that raw grit and determination and effort that James displays here is a big reason why I love his character. This is who James really is, when he's not caring about what he looks like or who he could possibly be. When James gets down to it, when James seriously cares about something, he's going to put the most effort out of any engine. And this episode clearly displays it. It's an episode that I've shown how much I've liked before for anniversaries, as it's an episode that I've remade a couple of times on this channel. In fact, my original profile picture was from a deleted version of a remake I did back when I first made this channel in 2014. This is another classic, strong Thomas perseverance story, and ultimately shows off a lot of the best aspects of James, while also giving us some early indications of James and Edward's relationship. But we'll get to that in a future episode. Number 8. Duck Takes Charge. Now, this episode may seem like another quiet one, but this episode is actually massive in its impact on the show. What this episode does is change the dynamic between tank engines and tender engines, and introduces the character, Duck. Let's talk about the dynamic first, which is arguably the bigger part of the episode, and will feed into my discussion on Duck in this episode. Before this episode, tender engines were in charge of the yard, and tank engines were subservient and meant to follow them. Thomas and Percy did this begrudgingly, Thomas more with a joke and Percy kinda sighing and hating it, but that was the way things were. Fortunately, when Duck arrives, that changes. Duck gets bullied once by the big engines and immediately makes a decision. He decides it's time to stand up to them. And not only does he successfully stand up to them, but it changes things forever, as it puts Percy on Thomas's branch line, which would lead to a slew of other adventures for him. Also gives Duck a direct rival with the big engines, something that would be very impactful on a future storyline. But let's talk about Duck. Duck's a no-nonsense engine who's bound by his morals, and this episode teaches that very clearly and explicitly. Duck's not on the island long. We know he's hardworking, but immediately the way he defends Percy in ways that none of the other characters did before is amazing, despite only knowing Percy for about a day. Gordon, Henry, and James are also nice in this episode, as they play that bully type that they've played throughout the season. They also are more represented as a group rather than an individual, something that would be commonplace in this season. That dialogue is strong with many iconic lines, and ultimately, this is just another strong episode that I just really enjoy. Number 7. The Diseasel. Another Season 2 episode on this list, won't be the last. This is one of the funnier episodes of the series, and it introduces 3 of my favorite characters, Bill, Ben, and Boko. You'll notice a theme here amongst these episodes, so they feature characters that I really like, and this is an episode that features a bunch of them. This episode's dialogue is great, with so many iconic lines from the twins, and George Carlin's voice for them in the first place is hilarious. This might be one of the funniest episodes in the show, if not the funniest. The whole misunderstanding of Diseasel for disease and diesel is absolutely funny, and the fact that the drivers don't even try to correct it, they just play into it, this kind of shows the innocence of the show. This episode is prime Season 2, showing some great industrial sets of the harbor and the clay pits, and then moving out into the Ellsworth, the quieter side of the island. Only for Bill and Ben to make a mockery of that as they try to terrorize Boko. Yes, I do emphasize the word terrorize. The intimidate Boko scene is great, because the moment we see Boko, he looks like this mean, aggressive, angry Diesel. But as soon as we get to know him, he softens up and he realizes Boko's just a softie. But Bill and Ben don't know that, and they play into that hard. The way they actively try to psychologically screw with Boko is great. And once everything gets calmed down with Edward coming in at the end and everything getting explained, it's just a nice little episode. There's not a lot to this episode, but it's just a real feel-good story. It doesn't feel very serious. The twins think they have this mystery. It's not as mysterious as they think. They investigate. They try to catch the bad guy, learn he's not so bad after all, and make a new friend in the process. And ultimately, it's just a nice little time spent with the branch line engines. For number 6, I technically cheated, as I have 2 episodes, but I love them both for extremely similar reasons, and they're tied to one simple character. So, for number 6, Steamroller By George. I love George. Thomas and Friends had such great villains, from Diesel to Diesel 10, even characters like Bulgy. But the thing that they all had was a reason not to like the engines, or even some of the engines. George just hates pretty much everyone. Yeah, he complains about the railway, but he also has a thing against other road vehicles that make him look bad. These two episodes exemplify just what kind of character George is. We'll start with Steamroller, as it is the episode we are introduced to him first. Steamroller is a fun episode between George and Sir Handel. These two going back and forth the entire episode is very entertaining, and their characters bounce off of each other very nicely. I love the way the story is structured. We start off with Sir Handel being boastful and arrogant, and we slowly slip George into the story, with the rest of the Skarloey engines hoping it can humble Sir Handel. However, when it fails, for the most part in the end, it actually leads to a very entertaining ending. But Sir Handel and George's dynamic is priceless. They hate each other, because they're very similar characters. Sir Handel often complains and grumbles about nothing, and George just pretty much hates everyone. It's very hard to please these two, and it makes sense that they couldn't even please each other. And their scene, or their quote-unquote little battle against each other along the road, is iconic. And that's really the theme between these two episodes, is these iconic moments and clashes with the characters that George has. The way they just hurl insults at each other like two guys arguing in the streets of Brooklyn is absolutely amazing, and I love it. But let's get into By George, where George takes things up a notch. Bothering the little engines is one thing, but taking on the standard gauge line is a whole different level. And one thing I love from the get-go of By George is it starts off with George still pissing off the narrow gauge engines. He's talking to Skarloey and Rheneas, and even they're fed up with him. But George joins the other standard gauge engines, and he bothers Percy, Thomas, and many others very quickly, despite them hardly knowing him. I love especially the way Thomas gets under George's skin without even having to meet Thomas properly. George gets so annoyed at Thomas, just from that simple interaction, to the point where he declares war against him by essentially paving over his line and causing Thomas to murder probably hundreds of chickens, as well as derail a train. And things go up another notch as George threatens to take on Duck and, more importantly, Gordon. George's pettiness literally puts the Express in danger. And the fact that a character on the island is willing to go to this lengths to prove that he's better than everybody else is absolutely insane, and I love it. George is willing to put the Express in danger. That is psychotic. This is one of the first times in the entire series where the Express is involved in an accident. Thankfully, there's no derailment on Gordon's behalf, but an innocent truck is brutally murdered. These two episodes really involve the island well, and get George to get under all of the characters' skins, and showing just how much of a danger he can be to the rails. The question is, at the end of By George, is George supposedly reformed? He doesn't really get a lot of appearances after this, his lone appearance being in Calling All Engines, so it's hard to really know if George ever really changed. I guess for George's ending, it's up for interpretation. But me, I kinda like him the way he always was. Irritable. Number 5. Buzz Buzz / James Goes Buzz Buzz. I told you you'd see a fair few James episodes on this list, and this is another one. A simple slice of life story on Sodor that doesn't really have a moral or a plot to it. It's just simple, events happen and bad things occur. This episode again is another funny episode, with the circumstances of Bees being such an annoyance to James, and his hatred of Diesels leading to him to get ironically stung. It's just pure Audrey karma. I'm a big fan of the book Mainline Engines. In fact, it is my favorite of the Railway series, and this story is one of my favorites from it. It uses James well, and it builds upon the Railway series story here by adding some extra scenes with James, including the whole Bees Knees ending. I love how the story starts off as a serene, calm opening, and then James comes in yelling at Boko and being annoyed by him immediately ruin the serenity. James gets just exactly what he deserves here, and ultimately it's just a great episode. And of course, who could forget that beat scene? Another beautiful episode to add to this list. Number 4. Something in the Air. This episode, unlike the ones on this list, is on it because of its atmosphere and drama. And this might be the most tense episode of the show. Yeah, Toby and the Flood exists, but that's closer to being more of a thriller. This episode has building tension from start to finish. And it's really cool. The moment that the idea of high tides damaging the track is introduced, we all know something's going to happen, and the episode continuously builds upon it. And then, when Henry sets off, it begins. The music creeps in, and the feeling of dread washes over your body as you view this episode. And then the frantic messaging between the signalmen and the drivers, as they're trying to communicate the idea that Henry's in trouble, but no one's listening. And the music starts building more and more, and it gets more and more intense, until disaster strikes. This episode is so cool. On top of it, I'm really a big fan of Henry and Thomas's dynamic in this episode. Thomas is fed up with everything, and clearly puts up with a lot in this episode, as he does get dunked with fish. But Henry's just unnecessarily rude to Thomas that it's almost funny. All in all, this episode, with great music, great effects with water and fog, is just an enjoyable watch, and one that always keeps me on the edge of my seat every time I enjoy it. And also, let's be honest, this episode's got some great lines. All in all, a great example of what made Season 5 one of the best seasons of the show. Number 3, Old Iron. I told you that Edward and James' dynamic would come back into play, and this episode is that to a T. The episode starts off with James complaining angrily about Edward, and it immediately cuts to Edward laughing about it. And at no point in time in the episode does anybody else find it funny. Thomas and Percy are immediately angry at James, but James doesn't care. But let's get to the part of the episode everyone really likes. The chase scene. This is one of the early examples of action in Thomas. Season 1 had a few scenes like this, but nothing involving two different characters chasing each other down the line. This is filmed like a thriller action movie, and this is so cool. Seeing so much camera movement, the constant swaying and shaking of the characters, the constant moving of the camera up and down around set pieces to keep up with the two engines racing. These are some of my favorite shots of early Thomas. And for an episode that has a lot of human elements to it, it's portrayed very well, and I think is an underrated part of this episode's production. But back to James and Edward. Once these two are finally saved and everything is resolved, I love how Edward is cracking jokes. At no point in time did Edward ever take anything James said seriously, as it really wasn't a big deal to him, he never cared. But James learned so much about Edward. And despite that the story focuses so much on James, it really is a story about Edward. That, irregardless of what anyone does to him, he'll constantly come to the rescue. Edward's the oldest engine and he managed to chase down James. I mean, Edward was an express engine back in his day, long before his time on Sodor, and probably in his early Sodor days. But the fact that Edward was still able to do that despite clanking and making sounds and shaking and probably almost coming to pieces shows how much he cares. And it shows a lot about James too. James is petty, he's impatient, but at the end of the day, he's not completely stupid. At the end of the day, James knows a person's true worth beyond physical looks. He understands what kind of engine Edward is and respects that. And it's something that does carry throughout the show for the most part. All in all, a great Season 2 episode. Number 2, Horrid Lorry. An episode that has a little bit of everything that I like in Thomas. It's got great dialogue. I love the characters in it. It's funny. It's got some decent action. And it actually has a really interesting storyline behind it. But let's dive into it a little more. This episode's introduction of the Horrid Lorries is a pretty well done one. I love how it takes place at the docks, with all the characters coming in and out and dealing with these characters, and eventually go around the island seeing these lorries in different environments, and it makes it very entertaining. These characters, a lot like George, are just bad people for no reason. They hate Percy and the other engines for seemingly no reason other than competition, and they just pick on them. And the characters' reactions to each lorry are unique but also very hilarious. And I really like what this episode does for Toby. This episode calls back to Toby's early days, when he was replaced by buses and lorries and he and Henrietta was soon to be shut away. And we see those fears coming to life again for Toby. We never really saw that, we were just told that was what was happening, as by the time we met Toby in this series, it had already happened, he was being replaced and his days are being numbered. We never saw Toby's interactions with the lorries and buses, but we get that here, and they're really great. Each scene building upon the anxiety and fear that Toby will be replaced. But when the lorries get their comeuppance in different but equal ways, it is a great sequence. One of my favorite scenes as a kid was watching the scene when everyone's back at the docks with the lorries slowly coming into frame again, figuring out what happened to each, as we only saw Lorry 2 drive off a cliff, which was nuts to see as a kid. And there's just the three sequences coming back into play, and the characters from the beginning of the episode coming back, everybody getting their one-liners in. It is an absolutely great experience. And at the end of the day, this episode has some really beautiful shots, especially at the docks with all the trains and consists passing through. All in all, another great entry that was so close to being my favorite, but not quite. Speaking of entries that didn't quite make the list, I have a few honorable mentions. So, let's quickly breeze through them. And number one, my favorite episode all time from Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, is none other than Thomas, Percy, and Old Slow Coach. Not the episode you guys would have figured I'd pick unless you knew me very well, but this is my favorite episode of the show. But you might be asking, why? This episode isn't necessarily flashy. It's not one of the main episodes people talk about as being the most exciting, awesome episodes of the show to see. So why is this one my favorite? This is an episode that I think is not necessarily great at anything, but it's good at everything. It's got everything that I love about Thomas in it. It's got action, dialogue, great character usage, it's witty, it's got drama. So let's break this episode down a little bit. I love that this episode focuses on what is essentially could be called the series' three main characters, Thomas, Percy, and James. We start this episode with a beautiful sunrise that's immediately ruined by James complaining, and it just feels so right for this universe. We get pretty shots and the characters still aren't happy. And then we dive into themes of scrap, something that kind of moves its way throughout the show, and we meet Old Slow Coach, this derelict old coach that have been left to rot in the scrapyards that'll eventually get broken up. And then we trip into some action as James's fuel train catches on fire, and it's a huge, intense thing. I mean, for goodness sakes, one of the series' main characters is set right next to flaming tankers that could essentially explode at any minute. Obviously they don't. And then we get some witty comments from Percy at the whole situation that again could have been deadly. And then things get serious again. And then there's another fire in this intense action scene where Thomas and Percy are left to fend off this workman's hut. And then it's destroyed. But then everything comes together, they save Old Slow Coach, and they give her a home. These ideas, these themes, the idea that the characters stand by each other, they'll stick up for anyone. They're willing to help one another. And they're not afraid to be honest with each other. They're not afraid to put each other down. This is what Thomas and Friends is. It's an honest take on characters, going through things learning lessons, dealing with experiences. Something that it's hard to do and make it feel so organic, but Thomas has done so for so long. These characters aren't perfect people, or engines for that matter. They're just simply reacting naturally. Nothing's ever truly ideal, but they deal with it nonetheless. And this episode is the epitome of that. This episode, in the grand scheme of things, isn't necessarily special. It's not necessarily the best, most well-made episode of the show, but it's an episode that has pretty much everything I love about Thomas within it. It features some of my favorite characters, it's got great action, it's got great dialogue. And it ultimately reflects on the life lessons and the ideas and themes and motifs that permeate throughout the show. This, to me, is what Thomas and Friends is, and that is why it's my favorite. If you guys enjoyed this list, I might consider doing other top 10s in future. Other than that, I thank you guys for spending some time with me to celebrate my 9-year anniversary on YouTube. Can't wait to make more content for you guys. This is Train King James signing off. See you around, guys.